Thank you, David and Bonnie, for both being here for this conversation around the exhibition titled Precipice, of these three concurrent exhibitions dealing with environmental use and human interaction on the landscape. David, I'll introduce you real quick. David Maisel is an artist working in photography and video. For more than 30 years, he's produced aerial photographs of compromised landscapes in a multi-chapter series titled Black Maps. These images reveal the physical impact of activities such as mining, logging, urban sprawl, and military testing. And among his chief concerns are the politics and aesthetics of radically human-altered environments, and how we perceive our place in time through cultural artifacts from both past and present. He's a recipient of a 2018 Guggenheim Fellowship in the Creative Arts, as well as many other awards and honors, and his photographs have been the subject of 7 monographs. Also here is Dr. Bonnie Roos, and Dr. Bonnie Roos is faculty at West Texas A&M University, where she's professor of English and the department head for English, Philosophy, and Modern Languages, and research director for the Sybil B. Harrington College of Fine Arts and Humanities. Dr. Roos holds Bachelor of Arts degrees in Fine Arts and Comparative Literature from the University of California at Santa Cruz, a Master's of Arts in Art History and Comparative Literature, as well as a PhD in Comparative Literature from the University of Oregon. Her research and publications are linked by her focus on 20th and 21st century nationalism and gender issues. Dr. Roos's research also focuses on transatlantic modernism and post-colonialism. It's a real honor to have both of you here for this conversation. I look forward to listening and hearing your insights and getting more perspective on the photographs in this exhibition.
Thanks, Alex.
If I got all that right.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction.
Maybe we could start maybe hearing from you, David, about your start with photography. Why photography, and particularly why aerial photography has become central to your practice.
Sure. Thanks, Alex, for that lovely introduction. And photography kind of surprised me as an arena to work in. From a pretty young age, I thought I wanted to be an architect, and I went through a lot of education and training and work in that field, but I shifted into photography in part because I wanted to make things. I wanted the immediacy of making things, and architecture was too slow for me. And also, specifically, I had the opportunity to study with the photographer Emmett Gowan, who was teaching at Princeton, where I was doing my undergrad. And Emmett was working on a long-term project at the volcano Mount St. Helens in the aftermath of the eruption there. And I was able to accompany him on one of those photographic expeditions. And that kind of gave me this incredible place to begin thinking about things that interested me already, that had interested me in architecture, the kind of border between the human-made and the natural world. And also the way architects think about space. Most of what we did at St. Helens was working on the ground with large format cameras, 4x5 and 8x10 cameras. But we did do some work from the air. So that was my introduction to working from the air. And I really took to it right away. There were a lot of sort of differing reasons why. One of them really had to do with this sense of mapping, and the way that architects think about space. You know, they might look at something from above, or draw it from above, render it from above, you know, as a plan, or look at a cross section or something, right? So there's this kind of analytical way of representing space that the aerial view, in a way, kind of echoed. So that's kind of where it began for me, was that experience of working with Emmett Gowan and working at St. Helens.
You have spoken in some of your interviews about the desert specifically as having structure. And I was hoping that I could piggyback on this question about architecture and have you play with that some. We live in the plains and we live near the Palo Duro Canyon, and structure is something that people identify the desert with emptiness and with, oh, you can just spread out and there's as much room as you like. And tell me what you see when you see the desert and how you hope to capture it in your photographs.
Yeah, I've worked in a lot of different desert environments, and I would count even Los Angeles as one of those environments. Worked on the eastern side of the Sierras, worked most recently in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And there is this idea that the desert is this kind of empty zone, right? But I think that's really kind of false. The desert has infinite sort of possibilities in it. The deserts that I've been looking at have been transformed by human action, mining most particularly in the Atacama, Owens Lake on the eastern side of the Sierras in California that was drained to bring water to LA. So I'm kind of looking at the desert as a kind of repository of human error. Maybe that's most of what I'm looking at in terms of, you know, landscape work anyway, is the way that the desert has become a kind of synthetic landscape, a landscape that's been transformed by human activity.
And precarious.
Yeah, yes, and precarious, and fragile, and abused, and in a way scarred. I think there's a kind of trauma that I'm looking at in the landscape in general, and I think the desert reveals that most clearly, those kind of traumatic changes and disturbances.
I'm from Oregon, and I cannot separate my state from the association of green color. So I was actually surprised that I know you do some black and whites, but and the one that I was devastated by was your 1989, The Forest.
Sure.
And it was just like, and I was surprised actually that it was so powerful without being the Oregon green that I associate with Oregon. But most of the photographs that we have in our exhibition are brilliant, and people who have not been to see your photographs before will be struck by how brilliant they are and how the color used walks those lines between abstraction and representation. Could you tell us a little bit about how you decide when to use color and when not? Yeah. And you tell us a little bit too about how you achieve the color.
Sure. Well, photography is not just a translation of reality, but a million decisions about how to translate reality, right? If you're really practicing it. So, you know, when I began as a photographer in the fine arts, one was largely working in black and white, right? And that's how I began. And I really loved the kind of alchemy of the darkroom, processing my own film by hand and making my own prints. And so that was really a sort of integral part of me, in a way, you know, mastering the medium. Maybe that's too strong a word, but exploring the medium. So at St. Helens, you know, when I was an undergrad, I probably didn't even bring a single roll of, or a single sheet of color film with me. It wasn't even in my vocabulary. In the mid-1980s, I was really fortunate to receive an NEA grant back when they gave individual artist grants, and that enabled me to start this aerial project looking at mining throughout the Rocky Mountain region. And again, I only worked in black and white. And it was only when I revisited some of those sites a few years later, after I'd been living in New York, and after I had had exposure to certain contemporary art that was much more kind of vehement politically, and I'm not really necessarily visually, but politically, like Jenny Holzer's work, for example. That was all text, mostly text-based, right? when I revisited those sites, I realized that the content, that lurid color, that kind of super saturated artificial color that was in the landscape, in these mining landscapes, that was so highly toxic, right? That was the power of these places. It wasn't beautiful, right? And it wasn't aestheticized, it was just real. And the color in my work now, you know, I'm still shooting film. I'm not shooting digitally, but I am making my own prints in-house, not in a traditional darkroom anymore, but as an inkjet print, a pigment print. And so I'm controlling the color, but I'm not sort of falsifying it. There's no need for me to do that. In a way, it wouldn't really interest me. No.
And I think the juxtaposition, if you could speak a little bit to the role that aesthetics plays in your work. I mean, when you walk in, these photographs are huge and they're gorgeous, and the viewer's immediately drawn in, but that beauty is a symptom of its destruction, yes? And so that jarring juxtaposition between environmental devastation and beauty of the sort of scopophilic love of looking. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about why and how that's part of your
seduction and betrayal, right?
There we are. I was glad you said
it. Yes. No, that color, you know, beauty is like a tool, right? And it is a kind of seduction to pull you into the image, to perhaps even let the image stay with you long after you're no longer standing in front of it. That's another reason for the scale, because you have a certain encounter with it because of your own human scale and its scale as well. So those are aesthetic decisions, and the entire way that I work is really driven by aesthetics, for sure. So we're so used to the idea that beauty is shallow, or it can carry no meaning, and that's not really true. You know, beauty can be about betrayal. Beauty can be about kind of a new aesthetic territory. You know, I mean, I think for me, that's really a primary thing. Is especially when I began working from the air, when the aerial view was much less normative now than it might be now, right? There was this kind of sense of we need to expand our ideas of what landscape really encompasses, right? So, you know, we have ideas, or even photography as an art form. You know, we sort of look to, like, or maybe we did look to Ansel Adams, who would take these incredible photographs of Half Dome and Yosemite. Like, these were beautiful landscapes, right? So what's left off the map there, and what remained invisible, were the landscapes that were not, you know, that we're sacrificing, right? And the sites that we don't get to witness or encounter because they're remote, because we're not intended to see them, because they're hidden from view. You know, you mentioned the pictures from the forest series. So those are all actually in Maine. And the way that clear cutting operates in Maine is, and probably I would imagine in the Pacific Northwest as well, is that if you're traveling on the waterways, you can't tell that the clear cutting is just beyond, right? So they leave this swath of you know, forest, and then beyond that, is where the clear cut exists. So you're not sort of intended to get a glimpse of these places that are actually dedicated to us being allowed to live as we do, right? I mean, the mines are taking stuff out of the earth so that we can have our iPhones, and we can have our cars, and we can have our infrastructure and our laptops, and our, you know, have this Zoom talk, and the books that are behind me and behind you, like all of the natural resource, and photography as a medium too is reliant, right? So
jets, right, and airplanes that use for the aerial.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's just like, I don't know how you're doing it right now. It's just.
Well, right now I'm not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely waiting it out. But and I really grappled with that at the beginning. You know, when I first came back from that very first project that I did from the air with that NEA funding, and I processed all my black and white film. And at that point, I was living almost off the grid on the coast of Maine. You know, I thought, how can I? What's my intent with these pictures? You know, how can I? Am I just making these pictures to point out the fact that these mining companies are evil or bad, when I'm in fact using the minerals and the metals through photography to make those pictures, right? So I'm implicated, and that was what I came to understand, was I couldn't be outside of it. I had to accept my own, the degree to which I was enmeshed in it, and maybe that we all are. And that kind of let me move forward with it, because they're not meant to only point a finger at a particular industry or a particular company, but rather really to point out what allows us to what damage we're doing to the earth in order to have the existence that we do.
And that's one of the things that I really loved about your work, is that sort of not overly didactic version of it that I think will appeal to folks around here in Amarillo as well. I think, for example, in the fall, the Fuensalida Dos that you do with the Spain and Toledo, which are really abstracted and really, they look, I think I've heard you describe them as alien sort of landscapes, but these are dryland farming from the epicenter of Europe's food center. And of course, here in Texas, we are comparably in the breadbasket of the nation, and that we make a lot of our money from farming. We're dependent upon it, but we also have a sense that the Ogallala Aquifer, which we depend on for our farming, is a fossil resource, which is designed for our use and which we are running out of, and which we have a terminal date of when civilization here will end. And in this area, right? I mean, so we will not be able to sustain that. And it's sort of some of the reasons that I'm interested in your work as, and maybe you could speak to this, openly complicit, as metaphorical, as universal, as this is Toledo, Spain. This is not just anywhere, it's very specific, but it's also our world here in Texas. And I'm not trying to overly generalize and take anything away from the beauty of your work, but I mean, it speaks to us here too. And I wondered if you could speak to that metaphorical quality, that universal quality.
I mean, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head really beautifully, Bonnie. They're not purely documentary pictures, you know, and I would be very uncomfortable if they were overly didactic. And I'm careful, actually, not to even title them. I kind of swing back and forth with this, but early on, I was titling my pictures much more explicitly. And I saw in an exhibit how viewers moved through the space and read the titles and then made their conclusions about the work. And the conclusion was largely, this is a bad multinational corporation, right? And it's not, that was so simplistic. And I realized it was my own doing, that I needed to pull back from offering a wall label that could take the place of the pictures. But I really want the pictures to, first of all, I even call them pictures versus photographs, because I think the word pictures, I mean, that's just, without even thinking about it, that's how I think of them. Their pictures aren't facts, right? You know, they might offer information, but they're not facts, right? And so that's how I think of these. They're aesthetic considerations, and their offerings, and they're you know, I want them to be open to interpretation, right? and that you don't necessarily have to understand everything going on in a picture in order for it to have some kind of power or even to influence your thinking, you know. So most of the sites that I'm working at, I don't fully grasp the entirety of the complexities of the environmental issues at hand or the histories that are there. So I have to learn as well. And I think the Lake Project is a really good example of that. You know, that's looking at a specific lake in California that had existed for some 75 million years before being drained and diverted into the California aqueduct system to bring water to Los Angeles, about 230 miles away. I didn't really know that, that whole history that much when I began to work there. I had encountered it almost by accident and on the ground. And the fact that it occupied this central position in the history of California and the history of water in the West, and that its destruction enabled Los Angeles to come into being, you know, I had to kind of learn all of that myself. And I think it's important for me to keep that kind of, not naivete, I don't want to be, I'm not interested in that, but to understand that I'm not the expert. You know, I'm not an environmental engineer or hydrologist or whatever. So I can learn as much as I can learn and expose myself to as much information as possible. And that to me is part of why I make the work too. The reason I went to Chile to start working in the Atacama was I had purchased a diesel car because I wanted to be environmentally sound, and it, you know, it was a Volkswagen, and it turned out that was a debacle. And I started thinking about, well, what do I do next? Do I go electric? And I thought, oh, there's got to be more to this than meets the eye. And I started researching where lithium comes from, and lithium powering these electric car batteries, as well as our iPhones and our laptops. And I realized that the Atacama was the source of most of the planet's lithium, and it's being mined at this, you know, exponentially increasing rate. And so, but I go in as a beginner, you know, as somebody who really is there to learn, you know. I think it's really important for me to maintain that angle of approach. But I'm not, I don't think that these pictures, you know, are the yes, they're taking the facts at hand, but of course the pictures are still open to interpretation, and that's what I want.
Well, and I'll jump in. I also think that there's a unique perspective of you in a plane. I mean, you could counter that with Google Earth images. There's other ways that you could get a snapshot vertically of these operations or these places. But in looking at the images and seeing the point of view of looking through this, you know, the very small lens of your camera in a very specific place at an altitude that's so high, and capturing just what's in that aperture for that moment, I think speaks to more like your aesthetic process, and, you know, than it does saying factually looking at, you know, straight Google images.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's very important for me to put myself bodily, you know, into these settings, because you're right. At this point, you know, satellite views can provide a lot of information, or Google Earth, and those are good tools for me at this point to use as a research tool. But I'm not interested in, you know, downloading a file and printing it, you know, or something like that. I want to, and in fact, I'm hand-holding the camera, right? And as I'm working with a pilot, having them bank the plane so that I'm actually shooting sort of down and backwards. So the image that results is there just for a fraction of a second, right? Like a 500th of a second, basically, and then it's gone, right? And so even as I'm not, for example, putting the camera in the belly of the aircraft, which might result in something that's more like purely cartographic. So actually the way my images are made, they're actually kind of, for the most part, they're kind of stretching and twisting the forms of the earth in particular ways that exist just for one frame, right? So I might circle around the place a number of times and photograph it from different angles or different elevations, work with the pilot that way to sort of choreograph things. But, you know, every frame will be different.
Yeah, and all without horizon. You know, there's no end.
Right.
So, but that is such an odd contradiction among many in your works, right? That you're embodied and occupying, and I love that phrase because, of course, it connotes all sorts of things. That you occupy these spaces, but that they are dehumanized and that they are lacking in horizon, and that this is both human and not human all at the same time in these really provocative ways. I'm wondering, I'm not framing this as a question very well. I'm wondering how you talk about yourself as embodied in the art when you're shooting it from so high.
Well, it's a translation of reality. Again, I mean, it's highly subjective, right? But I guess at this point, I mean, yeah, there's ways that, you know, the aerial view can be seen as kind of like mechanistic or sort of militarized or God's eye, or, you know, the, you know, man taking dominion over the earth or something like that. I guess from my experience, it's none of those things personally, because I'm in this like tiny little speck of a Cessna. I am completely dwarfed by the scale of these settings that I'm working in. You know, I'm like in a little, you know, tiny, imagine like a little tiny Volkswagen Beetle car, you know, with wings, you know, it's like, it's a little Cessna. And what it does is it offers a view that's not familiar, right? It's a defamiliarized, abstracted vision of the earth in a way. I don't feel like the pictures are dehumanized. I feel like they're, in fact, they have all kinds of residue of human activity in them, you know. And I'm really not very good at taking pictures of, you know, pure nature. Like I just can't get motivated to do that. So there's something happening there. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but
it does. It suggests to me, at least, that the subjectivity is the part of it where the humanization occurs for you, at least partly. Maybe I'm not articulating them, but and maybe it's just contrived in the way I'm reading you. But I wanted to actually take you back to the Lake Project series for that reason, to talk about this. I mean, and you talk about yourself as sort of a student, which is something I admire. I wonder if we as academics don't spend a lot of time, way too much time, talking about what we know and not enough time about what we're figuring out still and what we have to learn still. But the Lake Project series in particular, this is a really iconic spot. This is something that filmmakers and photographers have, eco-critics and all the folks that I know have really done a lot of work with it, and to have you go back to it is such an interesting choice. And I wonder if you could talk about that as, I don't know, part. I mean, one of the things that strikes me in all of your works, and I was looking at The Fall, and it was a response to El Greco, and I was looking at The Terminal Mirage, which is a response to The Spiral Jetty by Smithson, and I'm looking at the Lake Project series, and I'm seeing iconographic traditions here, that you really place yourself within a tradition not just of land art, but of art in its capital A ways. And I wonder if you could talk about yourself in those, or your work in that context, particularly with the Late Project series or with Terminal Mirage or whichever you prefer, but as an artist.
Yeah. So, I talked a little bit about having this background in architecture, right? And then switching over to studying photography, but that wasn't really the full picture. The full picture is the way a student was allowed to focus on visual arts, where I was an undergrad, was to be an art history student, right? So I was an art history student, and in fact, I probably spent more time on the academic side than I even had time to spend making my own work. But the two grew up together. They were interlaced. And I'm conscious at certain sites that I'm sort of channeling my love of mid-century modernism, whether it's like Diebenkorn or Frankenthaler or Rothko, or, and thinking about the kind of end game of modernism, like I just feel like a lot of the sites that I look at probably trace back, well, in some ways they trace back to this notion of progress, right? That modernism also kind of embraced. And so, especially like with Proving Ground, which isn't in the show, but the way that the land is kind of a recipient of this activity where we feel like I might be getting off track.
It reminded me of Stella. I mean, I was just like, Frank Stella, it's got to be. I mean, I just sat there looking at the Proving Ground images and just went, oh my God.
Okay. That's amazing. No, that's amazing, because Stella was my first aesthetic experience where I was so riveted and I was so like possessed by an artwork. And it was the summer I was 16 years old, and I spent it at Andover, where I think Stella had actually gone. But I was doing a summer program there, and they have a beautiful small museum there. And I walked in, and there was a Stella pinstripe painting, and it just killed me. I didn't understand it. It was threatening, and it wouldn't let go of me. And so maybe take all of those things and like that's something that really interests me is, and artwork that I don't understand, artwork that somehow I can't accept. When I first encounter it, that's oftentimes the work that percolates and distills and stays with me and actually, changes me, right? Affects me. So Stella that's a great,
Let me interrupt you just really quickly and mention that the Proving Ground is a work of art in and of itself, and that you cared about everything from the images to the pages to the quality of in addition to the essays. And I would just say, because I doubt you will, that it's brand new and it's just out since January. And if you have downtime in the pandemic, it's such a worthy book. And so something to take a look at.
Thank you so much.
Just to page through and to feel the differences between the pages and I'm done now. And I just wanted to make sure that people knew that in our area.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much. Yeah, that I'm so pleased with how that book came together. It's published by Radius Books, and they are exceptional publishers. And Dave Chicky, who is the publisher, is also a remarkable designer. And I was really fortunate to work with Dave and with all of the contributors, the essayists as well. It's just, it's remarkable, really. In fact, order before midnight, and we'll throw in instead of 9. Yeah. Thank you. But I think, yes, like I'm constantly referring to other pictures, as I'm making new pictures. They kind of connect, and they sort of power my thinking, even sort of unconsciously. I mean, when I was in Chile in the Atacama, and I encountered these tailings ponds, I was immediately thinking about these Robert Motherwell pictures that I had seen decades earlier at the National Gallery, the Elegy for the Spanish Republic, and these enormous kind of black and white abstract pictures, and I couldn't get them out of my head as I was making my own pictures. So there's a way that it kind of supercharges the encounter for me with the actual site if there's something else going on. And sometimes it's not as so immediate as that or conscious in the moment. Sometimes it happens later in the editing process, things like that.
What do you think about art's complicity in all of these? One of the things that I study is, I study the Irish famine. And so what I'm interested in is the fact that in the midst of the Irish famine, we have connections here at WT because our local rancher, Charles Goodnight, his business partner was John Adair, and the Amarillo Museum of Art has pictures of John Adair, who is, by all historical accounts, not a particularly nice person. And he had great visions, but his wife was greatly loved, and I'll talk about her for just a second. But they ended up throwing all of the peasants off the land shortly after the Irish famine, when things were still bad, in order to build this gorgeous castle in like Queen Victoria's retreat. And they took the money that they had, the proceeds that they had won and earned in West Texas, and put the money into the land and the castle there. And among the things that happened there, Cornelia Adair, the wife, built these gorgeous churches, these little gold nuggets is what they call it, and gorgeous Celtic architecture, beautiful, extraordinary, brought handsmiths in to do the stonework and masons, and it, you know, fueled the economy and articulated a vision of religion that was loved and adored by the Irish to this day, who adore her and hate him. And it's one of those weirdnesses of art that when you have money and you choose to spend it on art, that you art has this strange place with politics that can speak to and also distract from. And it's a very, and you were talking about it as betrayal, and the betrayal was
seduction. Seduction.
Thank you for helping me. But I mean, what is art's complicity? What is art's power? Why put yourself in this tradition of artists? What good does art do? What good does what? Ooh. I'm not challenging you. I'm wanting answers. So forgive me if it's sounding aggressive.
Good does, no. I think art. Wow, this is great kind of arena to think about. I don't think it's either or. For example, you know, when I made those contact sheets and wasn't sure how to move forward, right, in my work, right, am I allowed to use these metals and minerals to make work? Am I allowed to use, you know, fuel to be up in the air, right? I didn't really give myself a pass, but what I felt was that my kind of capacity as a human being is to make pictures. That's what I do. That's what I do better than anything. And I've been doing it, you know, for, I don't know, a long time. And that I could take all of that energy and say, no, really what I should do is become an environmental attorney, you know, but that would have killed a part of me, you know? So I feel like I had to have an angle of approach to putting my concerns forth in the world that was still part of who I was naturally, and that I had to learn how to respect that. It wasn't kind of an immediate thing, but I really had to respect it. I don't know if that's really answering the question, but I do think that right now it feels like we're at a moment in time where museums, maybe in particular, and cultural institutions in particular, are having to rethink how they move forward, and maybe even rethink their own histories, and rethink, you know, how they have acquired certain objects, and whether that's ethical. And I think that, to me, it's not just a question of politics, but it's a question of ethics as well. You know, And so I think it's a really healthy kind of grappling that I think a lot of institutions are hopefully, doing in this moment, and, long overdue in a way. But history isn't like a fixed thing, I mean, even if it's a written history, we're allowed to rewrite it, I mean, I not to whitewash it or black it out, but, write over it. But it's almost the way when an art conservator now might try to, if they're working on a piece of art that has been damaged, in the process of repairing it, they don't want to cover up that fault so that it can't be undone later. Like, there might be another way to interpret this artwork later. So we can't just erase the past to move forward. We have to kind of incorporate it and let the past still be understood and seen, and then go forward from there.
And judge it from our own places. It does, absolutely.
But aesthetics for me and art are as important and as essential as politics. And art and aesthetics have been part of human nature and part of human history for millennia, right? So maybe right now, where we are as a society, we don't really understand or value art or even support it the way that we might. But to me, it's timeless, and I think quite a lot about what would remain, when I'm no longer alive. What remains? Like, so that book that I held up and that you described so beautifully, the books that I've made will remain and be accessible for people. So art has its way, or the artwork that I've made, hopefully, as well. Like, that to me, that's where our history is so incredible. It's not just studying dates, of when something was made, but it's actually a kind of like a prism or like a wormhole to dive back into what society valued, and to sort of understand the world through that, as well as just also an aesthetic experience. To me, like standing in front of a painting, whether it's a painting that was made yesterday or a painting that was made 500 years ago, it can have this incredible. I don't know the words to describe it, and then maybe that's why it is an aesthetic experience, but it can really kind of affect you on a really sort of primal level.
Oh yeah. Kind of art are you working on in the midst of this pandemic, given that you're out on aerial, and I don't know how you're handling your photographic supplies, but how are you managing? Because art is who you are, and I'm sure you're doing work. Yeah.
So, California went into quarantine in mid-March, thankfully, very early. And after a couple of weeks, my wife said, you got to stop following me around from room to room in our house. And, your studio is just a couple miles away. It's probably okay, if you go spend some time. Anyway, I came over here. I wasn't really even sure I was allowed to be here. I didn't turn on any lights for a while, and I was very quiet. I didn't open the Venetian blinds, but I started painting and drawing again for the first time in a really, really, really long time. It's something I used to do more when I was studying architecture. Actually, it's been a super long time. And so, I've been painting, and it's really interesting how exciting it is, and how fulfilling it is. And I mean, at first I was doing it because otherwise I thought I would just go crazy, because the world seemed like it was coming completely undone. So it was something I felt like I could turn everything off, I'm really enjoying it. And it, to me, it's on the surface, it seems so wildly different than, having a photographic, expedition where you fly here and you go there and you do this and you do that. but it's picture making, you know, and it's creating these imaginary spaces, which is something in a way that I've felt all along about these aerial locations, is that they're so otherworldly, they're almost made up. And in fact, before I became a photographer, I used to draw spaces that looked a lot like these aerial things that I've subsequently photographed. So, but yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Nice. Are there any pictures that we should be talking about that we have, like, specific favorites from the exhibition that we should be mentioning and that I have not covered?
I was looking behind me to see what's on the wall. Gosh, no, I mean, I think the there are two images that Alex has had up on the museum website, and one is from Terminal Mirage, and it's just sort of highly, almost like Dievencore or kind of way that space is kind of getting broken down. And another one is from the mining project, and that's, yeah, more like a color field painting. And so, yeah, and then so we've been sort of talking about those ideas, and I think they're well represented in those two pictures. So,
all right,
yeah.
Super.
Yeah. Also, Alex, I love the title of the show.
Yeah, me too.
I really do. Yeah. I mean, that sense of like we're on the edge of something that we might tumble into. You know, it's something that I've been feeling about environmental issues, like, you know, since I was a kid, actually, and certainly like through all of these different projects. But this fall in California with the wildfires we've been having, and waking up to, you know, a blood orange sky that just got darker as the sun moved higher in the sky, it felt like the apocalypse was really like right here. And that sense of precipice is like, it's a very apt word right now.
Cool. Glad you like it.
Yeah.
It has been absolutely a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm watching my clock so I don't hold you longer than an hour, but I could probably go on for another 2. And so, so I'm just conscious of your time, but thank you so much for your time.
Oh, Bonnie, my pleasure. These were great questions, and thank you for bringing all of that to our conversation. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for bringing your work to our world here in West Texas.
My pleasure. I was hoping to make it myself, and I, you know, we'll do it another time for sure. I'd love to make it down there.
Please know that you have an open invitation.
Lovely. Okay. Thanks to both of you.